everyone. Welcome back to the Roots Run Deep podcast. My name is Kiara. I'm one of your hosts, and I'm here joined with
Rafa. Hello, everyone.
Today's episode, we'll be talking about intersectionality. And like we usually do on the podcast, we like to start off with definitions. We're going to go ahead and do our own personal definitions. So if you want to start us off, Rafa.
Yeah, of course. So for me, intersectionality really puts a focus on the obstacles that people may be feeling, but in a very unique way where it's like individual. It's not the same obstacles for everyone. Yeah, that's kind of like my definition. Intersectionality focuses on obstacles that are not the same for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have a definition, but it's, I guess, more of like an abstract explanation. I don't know. I just think of like an image in my head. Just the word intersectional, like I just literally think of like an intersection, like when you're driving, like, you know, four ways where like the different streets meet up in the middle, and that middle point is kind of like the intersection. So I just like thinking of it like that. It's like all roads lead to this point. But obviously those roads come from different places. And yeah, that's how I view it in my little weird way.
I like that. It's more visual.
Yeah.
It's more visual than this like definition that I wrote down from a video where it might be Kimberly Crenshaw. The definition that they gave was intersectionality shows a compound or a combo of inequalities in a person. So I want to just say that like I feel like both of our definitions that we gave already, with the one that Kimberly has gave us, I feel like it already seems like it's coexisting. Like the both of us are understanding it in a way that intersectionality was supposed to be understood. But yeah, I feel like you have a little bit more of a better way of wording it than I do. So I'll pass it down to you if you want to kind of get more into detail.
Well, just going based off of like the original term and how it was used. Again, yes, it was coined by Crenshaw in her paper. I forget. Let me see actually what it was called. Wow, that's a long title. It was first used and coined, or where it became very popular and like associated with Crenshaw, was in her paper called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics. Very long title.
Very long.
But yeah, she's basically just talking about how, from the lens, I guess that's the thing, is it is in my, like, I like using the word lens because I feel like it's something that you can look at it through with the like idea of intersectionality. It's not necessarily like something you can pinpoint, but she likes using it, or she first used it, and it was created in the context of, again, coming from a Black feminist view on just the intersecting identities that Black women have. Just like a lot of times how, I guess, Black women in general like are kind of marginalized and put to the side, and a lot of times that does have to do with the fact that they're competing with these two identities that are very oppressed in our society. But rather than just facing it from either the perspective of being just Black or just a woman, not just woman, or being like a woman, like it's the compounding, like you mentioned earlier, the compounding of both of those identities and how that kind of creates like a different form of oppression not, I wouldn't say like, I wouldn't go as far as saying it's more or less, but it's just, it's different in its own respect. Yeah. I don't know where I was going with that. But yeah, that's basically how it was first used. So I guess we wanted to kind of focus on it from that framework more so, even though I think intersectionality is something that can be used in a lot of different like lenses from a lot of different perspectives at least. And I think the video that you took the definition from, Crenshaw even mentioned that how like how it's tied to a lot of different social justice movements for different people, obviously, but how, yeah, I feel like over time the term has kind of grown and become a little bit more general, not in a bad way, but just even like mainstream. I feel like a lot more people know what you mean if you say intersectional identities. But yeah.
It is a very good thing for intersectionality to really be viewed in a bigger picture, just because I feel like it allows us to be more inclusive and understanding all of these like inequalities, all of these like obstacles, and kind of, you know, paint a bigger picture of understanding that not every person of color is the same way. Yeah. You know, we all have different backgrounds, and sometimes we face very similar inequalities, obstacles, racism, but in very different ways. Mm-hmm. So I like the way you word it, just because I feel like it's more, it makes a little bit more sense than what I was originally trying to explain to you earlier. I feel like it really, it becomes more general now when it's being used today.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you mentioned it right now. I don't know if you wanted to kind of bring up like what you had, like your original thoughts on it and stuff. Like, I think, I don't know, I'd like to hear, or I'd like also the listeners to be able to hear it more.
Yeah, I could cover it a little bit. So for me, I feel like it just understanding intersectionality from a video from YouTube, which was, you know, just Crenshaw speaking about what intersectionality means. I feel like it kind of really sparked a very kind of like personal like point of view of like what intersectionality means to me, and how it was originally intended to be focused on Black women, and how it is a very difficult world to be living in as a Black woman, and with all these like intersectional identities. But then like thinking about most of people of color, like for example, me and you, Kiara, we both live in North Richmond. And for example, someone who lives in El Cerrito, which is usually white folk, I feel like that kind of already creates this intersectional identity where, like El Cerrito does face some issues with air pollution, but I feel like here in North Richmond, that intersecting identity of inequalities would be like, we face health issues, we face the pollution, we face our lands not being usable, like a lot of things being contaminated at the end of the day, right? But still going back to like that whole view where it originally came from, I think that's a very good example of how much intersectionality has been evolving to a more general like point of view.
Yeah. Even what you were just saying right now kind of like brought up the idea of like just like thinking of, I don't want to say so much an identity, I don't know if that's the way I want to frame it per se, but I don't know, I just think of like me as someone who lives in poverty. It's interesting because you can be a person of color in poverty, you can be a white person in poverty, and it looks different. Like you said, it's like, yes, there's that's maybe where you have the common ground of being in poverty, but again, there's different ways it manifests in how like you experience your life. If you're white, obviously you still have a lot more privileges, despite what your like financial background is. And then like, yeah, I don't know, I just thought that's I think an interesting thing to bring up, even though again, like I guess I don't know, I have a hard time saying if I believe poverty is an identity, because I do and I don't think it is. But I think that kind of brings up what we were talking about earlier before we started, sat down to record, of like the idea that like what identities in a way even mean to people. Like I think a lot of times the negative parts of certain identities is almost what makes them. And I'm like, again, I'm kind of hesitant to say that because I don't know, I don't want to be like we have to just kind of be okay with prejudice and like racism and things. But at the same time, it is important to acknowledge, right? That is the point of like this intersectional framework of like being able to view how, I don't know, identifying as, how looking as a certain group, certain identity plays a role in how like, your treatment in life. And like, oh my goodness,
like how much it does play a role in how like the outside sees you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for helping me out there. Of just like, yeah, how it's like it's a part of the identity in the world we live in. Mm-hmm. And that's just like, I think something that is worth acknowledging, because that's how we kind of learn to understand where people are coming from. Again, like understanding that like that difference of like how a white person who is living in poverty is still able to like go through the world differently than someone who might be like a person of color in poverty. And you can even go like farther from that and be like queer people in poverty, and just it's always going to like change the way that you experience life, but also how people experience you in a weird way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like I'm understanding the part that I really didn't think about that hard about like how people experience you, because I do feel like that is something that we sometimes can't control. Like I think that's what these, like when we talk about intersectionality, I feel like a lot of the time we can't control like our gender, we can't control our skin color, we can't control our culture, our religion, etc., right? And I feel like, but because we look this way, all of these things are already being seen upon you. And one of the examples that I'm thinking of right now, it's kind of like, yeah, like as a man of color, I do feel like there has been multiple encounters where like people are like, no, you look a little too like rough, or like, you look like you're more aggressive, why does your face look like that? If you really want to get a job out here, you should like really be more presentable. Mm-hmm. You should talk a little bit nicer. Your voice shouldn't be so deep or something like that, because it already, all of these things are kind of like these kind of stereotypes that a lot of people in our society or like in the world already looking at as just like not even getting to know someone. It's just like, oh, they're a person of color, like they have this type of history and we should watch out for that, And going back to like your example of a white person and a person of color in poverty, yeah, like I feel like the way that white people don't have to worry too much about how they present themselves is part of that as well. While, you know, a person of color, and this is something that I feel like a lot of the times I try to, a lot of the time I try to explain to people how, like, as soon as I meet them, like I feel like I push myself to try to fit this, like, not really fit, but kind of like make it known that I'm not a person that will judge, not a person that will be aggressive, not a person that is sexist, not a person who, you know, like fits all of those things that people already think I am, you know?
Yeah.
Like, and I feel like if, you know, the audience might not know this, but I have a beard that I've been growing out since I was like in high school. But this, I feel like there's a lot of times where like I hate my beard because I feel like it kind of portrays me in a more aggressive way. And I feel like that's something that's like kind of weird, because now you start thinking about how big like racism is as just towards people of color, and how sometimes we can't even control all of these like things that are coming our way just for being the people we are, right?
It does. It's interesting because, like you said, yeah, like the way that other people can kind of put stuff on you, and like, I don't know. I just think of it from my perspective. I've always thought that was like, what a weird thing to like have to navigate. Like, because I think to an extent, obviously it is important to like acknowledge, right? Like we had kind of like previously discussed that like notion of like a white person and saying that they are like colorblind, or they don't see color, they don't see race, and how that has its issues. And at the same time, it's like, I don't think it's any better to like kind of box people in. I think there's a lot of like expectations around like categories and categorizing yourself, which is like, I think difficult for a lot of people, especially here in the US. Like, you know, everybody comes from so many different backgrounds, and like, you know, it's such a melting pot of cultures and language and all this other stuff. So it's like, it's really difficult for people to kind of, at this point, I feel like, especially, to be like, this is what I am, and it's like a clear-cut thing. And I think that's why intersectionality, like that framework, helps so much, because you then understand like you can have things in common with someone, and even then they're gonna have differences in where they, like, I don't know, where they grew up, or what language they speak, or gender identity, or sexual orientation, or what, you know. It's like it starts like kind of spreading out more about, like, it's like a web. I feel like it just kind of like keeps growing. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does.
But yeah, I was just like thinking about that, and like, I don't know, I can like speak from like personal experience too, share a little bit, but I know that it was like kind of brought up in, again, that video that Crenshaw had made talking about intersectionality, where she like identified how like she used an example of like school, and how like young Black girls, I don't remember the statistic exactly, but they're more likely to be, what was it, expelled or suspended, yeah, from school, versus their white classmates who are also female or identify as girls. But just that, it like kind of brings up like how I feel like, I mean, for some of us, like school is kind of maybe the first place we kind of experience like interacting with other kids and like other backgrounds maybe. I don't know, like I think it's obviously dependent on like where you are in the world, but for me, like I think that's the thing is like I know this is a common experience for a lot of people, but just kind of going to a school where like I was not seeing people who looked like me at all. In San Francisco, like predominantly white or like Korean kids were like what I saw. And like growing up, it was me and like one other girl who was half Mexican, half white. So I was literally the only, I guess, Latina Hispanic person there. And it's just interesting because like I think especially like once you're at a young age, like my worldview started there, and I think even as I've grown up, I've like come to realize like that's kind of probably why, like as I got older, like people would always, you know, those comments of like, you talk white, or you like, you know, you think you're like so much smarter. It's just like, I guess because of the type of language I tend to use sometimes, like I don't know, just words I heard growing up, I like kind of gravitated towards. But like I always try to be mindful because again, like I think there is a level where like you start maybe kind of getting disconnected from like the roots of maybe your origin identity. And I think that's not a bad thing. Like change is good and stuff, but I also think like there is an importance in like acknowledging like where you came from and like who you are. And like I feel like we've talked about this a bit in our work of like not like, I know language has been a huge topic of discussion for us of like wanting things to be very accessible to people and not, you know, not like a I don't know, thesis paper written by like a like PhD student or something, like very heavy, very like complex words and stuff. And it's like, me personally, I do enjoy that stuff. And I do like learning about it and all that, but also I do see the value in like the value and also the harm that can be done when there's like a like not an even playing field almost, when like people maybe don't understand words. And especially when you do start like considering language, like I speak technically 3 languages, so like language is like really really like interesting to me and how it shapes how people view the world. Because like the more you learn about languages, like learning that, you know, there's literally not words that exist in other languages for things that we say in English, like it really does change how you see the world. So it's like, I don't know, I just think it's really interesting that again, even though there's all these like common, I guess, I don't know, identities, common like places that we come from, like you and I both being in the Bay Area, it's like we still have had so many completely different experiences. And it's not, some of it is based off of like, again, those things we mentioned, like gender identity and race and, you know, geography even, I feel like is a big one. But also just like the way that other people like experience and like interact with us, that also kind of starts like changing things. It's just like this constant, I don't know, constant flow. I'm like moving my hands as I'm like talking. Yeah.
It's a good visual for me. Yeah, I agree, because like going off of what you said about language being so important and how we always try to be inclusive, and going into like intersectionality in our community, I do feel like majority of our monolingual, like Latino or Hispanic, or even indigenous identifying community members, a lot of the time they're immigrants from south of the border, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that's such a important thing to keep in mind when we're doing our work, because sometimes they come to us and they're like, I don't even know how to write. I don't know how to read. And, I feel like that, plus people who do know how to do that, right? That are coming from these backgrounds as well, kind of like put you in the middle of like understanding that, oh, like these people from Mexico that came recently can read and write, and then like the people who are coming from Guatemala that are not able to, and I feel like that's another form of intersectionality that we can see within the work that we do. And then like going into how there's similarities, where I feel like there's similarities for myself and some of the community members, is that like I didn't start reading till I was in 5th grade, and it was because of the what's it called, like all the disadvantages that we had. Excuse me. All of the issues, all the obstacles that my family had, not being able to own a place, living in a homeless shelter, not knowing what school I'm going to next year because we're in a whole different location. I feel like all of those things, I could feel like I could identify a little bit with some of our community members. And like you said, it's you and I doing this work here at Urban Tilth, and we both have very different experiences living here in the U.S. and the interactions that we have with people. And it's literally just because we're very different. Like, that's intersectionality within itself, And I feel like, there's some things that we can't really, I don't know how to put it, like, we can't really escape from. Like, I feel like the fact that we're brown, like, being perceived as brown people, that's something that we can't run away from, right? But then, like, there's that whole upbringing. I feel like our upbringing, like, we were both born in San Francisco and, coming out here, I feel like there's that similarity. But then, like, different experiences here in North Richmond, I feel like when I first started talking to you about North Richmond, I feel like I was so curious, unknowing like what a girl would be doing out here in North Richmond, and I don't want to sound sexist or anything. Like, I know that women and girls could do everything that they want to do, but also thinking about how it is also very scary, just because I do have 3 sisters, and each one has had their own experiences on being catcalled, being followed, almost being abducted. I feel like all of these things play a big role in why I was so curious, and knowing like your background in North Richmond when we first got hired. I feel like that was like my first question, like, oh, like, what do you do out here? Like at the age of 10, I was riding my bike around here. So I'm wondering if we've bumped paths before, And I feel like that was one of the things that really opened my eyes to understanding that not everybody that lives in North Richmond has a very, like, by the book. I don't know how to explain it, but like by the book experience. Like, we both have also the fact that like the experiences of air pollution and poverty here in North Richmond,
Yeah.
But
yeah, no, I think that's like a great kind of like to bring it back to like kind of the original context of like, under the the lens of feminism and just in general how, and again, I do want to mention that we are using like a lot of binary terms when it comes to gender. We're just kind of simply doing that because the original context, it is pretty binary. But again, that's not indicative of personal views. But yeah, just like feminism, like just being in the world as a woman, as a female-bodied person, like your experiences are not fun most of the time. Yeah. But I remember us having that discussion as well, and like I think there was a part of me that, and there's always a part of me, like when I hear from the perspective of male-bodied people, like of how they are able to do certain things. And again, like you said, it's not that I can't, but just I think there's not certain anxieties that are there, and you know, for valid reason, but just like being kind of jealous of like, oh yeah, like, you know, I wish I felt comfortable enough to just like hop on my bike and go somewhere. But then it's like I then start having to think about like, oh, like, well, depending on what I'm wearing, like what kind of reaction am I going to get from people, and like all these other things. So it's like, I don't know. I remember that when we were having that conversation, there was a part of me, not only that like, oh, like I wish I could have that experience, but also just like kind of acknowledging and feeling a little bit more comfortable with where I was coming from. I think I had kind of felt a little bit self-conscious, like, because like you said, right, like just because I'm a female-bodied person, I can still do these things, but it's like my own fears. And again, it's not that these fears are coming out of nowhere. I'm not like, you know, I want to acknowledge that, but it's also like, I don't know, it'd be nice to be able to like do things like that, but also like that's just my life experience, and like that's valid. And I think that's why, like, I've been saying like a lot, that's why to me the lens, the framework of intersectionality is so important, because it's like even just talking about it, like we're kind of like getting into like how big of a topic it is. And I think like what we're kind of leaning towards is like the idea of how that is relevant in our work, like Just Transition organizers and Just Transition as its own framework. It's like the idea of wanting that, as you mentioned, inclusivity and just making space for everyone. And I don't think you can actually make space for other people if you can't try to understand them. I don't think you'll fully ever understand other people, especially if it's experiences you've never had, but more of the listening and having a conversation about it is like what I think is so great, right? It's like you take a big topic like this and you just see where it goes.
Yeah. And kind of going into like one of our previous episodes is like, yeah, like we're not at like, I'm never going to understand your experiences like living here in the Bay Area, or just as you as a person, right? To the T. I don't think I'll ever do that, right? And it's not because I don't want to. And I think it's just because I can't put myself in those shoes. And I feel like I was saying, going back to a previous episode, we can stand in solidarity and, you know, understand how different our backgrounds are and how we can show up for each other in that way. To like, you know, like we've always said, our community knows what it needs, and sometimes like we just got to show up for it, you know. So right now I feel like what you were talking about really put that in perspective, and like how, you know, if we want to be pushing this framework of Just Transition, the Just Transition framework, we have to keep in mind like the intersectionality identities or intersecting identities to really make a world where it is very inclusive.
Yeah.
Where like there's nothing that could possibly marginalize you. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's important in the idea of creating like a very regenerative like world, right?
That's where intersectionality comes in for me in my mind of like, there's still going to be differences. Like people are always going to be different. That is just natural law. Like diversity is necessary. Like we have to be different. And how do we learn to like create space and understand each other so we can like, I don't know, move towards common goals together, right? Like finding those common grounds I think is so important. And again, like that's why it's like also really great to have these conversations. I know it's just us, and I wish it could be like, I don't know, not thousands. I'm too nervous for that. But I wish it could be a lot more people, chiming in about, because like, it's just, I love hearing like what other people have to say about their own experiences, and, finding those little places where like, oh yeah, like I relate to that. And like, I've experienced that before. Yeah.
I guess I could take this time to open that up. Like the comment sections are always open, and if you do, like Kiara mentioned, feel relatable to something that we are saying, leave it down in the comment section. And if you're not feeling like we covered a perspective or an idea fully, you could drop it down in the comment section. And in the previous episode, I believe it's episode 5, I said how if you leave a comment, like we'll shout you out. Unfortunately, there was no comments under the 5th episode, but we will be trying to be inclusive in that way, so it doesn't feel like it's just us speaking, and really going into the comment section, because this podcast is not just ours, it's the whole community's.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for tuning in, and thank you, Kiara, for taking a lot of the intro this time for this episode. I appreciate it. I think that it will be very good for our listeners to also get a different voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you, Kiara. And thank you, everyone who listened today.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.